"You want a home, and we want a mother," the twin Apache girls said to the homeless black widow. The dust clouds followed Adelina Monroe into Copper Ridge like ghosts from her past. Her worn carpetbag held everything she owned. Her late husband's pocket watch ticked against her ribs with each weary step. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned. Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her ledger with the expression of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant. Addie approached the counter. Her voice came out smaller than intended when she asked about credit for basic supplies. Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp as winter wind. She announced to the entire store that she didn't extend credit to vagrants. She questioned what someone like Addie was doing in their respectable town anyway. Heat flooded Addie's cheeks. Every person in that store watched her retreat empty-handed. Their whispers followed her onto the dusty street. Sheriff Nolan Graves found her that evening in the church pews. His boots echoed in the empty space as he approached. He told her she couldn't stay there. Town ordinances prohibited it. His tone suggested he wished the rules were different. Addie gathered her carpetbag without argument. She had nowhere else to go. The next morning brought Sela's hawk. The banker's smile was all teeth and no warmth. He offered her work scrubbing his floors. The pay was insulting. His charity felt like another kind of humiliation. Addie took the job anyway. Winter was coming. That afternoon, while she worked, children gathered outside the bank windows. They pointed and laughed. Some picked up stones from the street. Two girls appeared from nowhere. They didn't throw stones back or shout. Instead, one started singing loudly in a language Addie didn't recognize. The other began an elaborate dance. The stone throwers got distracted and wandered away. The singing girl had braids down to her waist. The dancing girl wore the same face. Twins, Apache by their clothing and features, maybe 12 years old. They looked directly at Addie through the window. Their eyes held something she hadn't seen in weeks: kindness. That evening, Addie sat on a crate behind the general store. She had nowhere to sleep again. Her stomach was empty. Her hope was emptier. Footsteps approached in the darkness. The twin girls emerged from the shadows like spirits. The one with longer braids spoke first. Her English was careful but clear. She said Addie wanted a home. They wanted a mother. The shorter twin nodded. She explained they had been living alone since their grandmother died. They had a place in the canyon. Hidden, safe. Addie stared at these children who saw something in her that no one else had seen. They offered her what she needed most. They asked for what she thought she could never give again. The pocket watch ticked against her ribs. Her husband's memory seemed to whisper approval. She nodded. The canyon hideaway took Addie's breath away. Red rock walls curved around a natural shelter that the twins had transformed into something resembling home. Animal hides stretched across wooden poles. A fire pit sat surrounded by smooth stones. Water trickled from a spring higher up the cliff face. Chiara pointed to different areas and explained their purposes in her careful English. Simi added details in rapid Apache, then translated key points. They had survived here for 3 months. Their grandmother had taught them well before the fever took her. Addie set her carpetbag down beside their sleeping area. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like peace. The twins were remarkable. Chiara could identify every plant within miles and knew which ones healed wounds or settled stomachs. Simi drew pictures with charcoal on smooth rock surfaces. Her artwork captured not just how things looked, but how they felt. Addie's teaching instincts awakened as she watched them. When Chiara struggled with reading, Addie showed her how to break long words into smaller pieces. When Simi wanted to write stories to go with her pictures, Addie helped her organize thoughts into sentences. The girls were hungry to learn. They soaked up every lesson like desert ground drinking rain. One evening, Simi led Addie to a special place deeper in the canyon. Ancient symbols covered the rock walls. Bones weathered white by centuries of wind lay arranged in careful patterns. Chiara explained this was where their ancestors rested. Her grandmother's grandmother lay here, and her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. The twins were the guardians now. Addie understood why they fought so hard to stay. This wasn't just land. This was legacy. Meanwhile, Sheriff Graves discovered troubling documents during a routine inspection of Hawks Bank. Property deeds with signatures that didn't match older records. Land transfers dated after the supposed sellers had died. Legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Graves spread the papers across his desk. His experience told him these documents were forgeries. His conscience told him to investigate further. His practical mind warned him about the consequences of challenging the town's most powerful man. Hawk sensed the sheriff's suspicion. He began visiting businesses throughout Copper Ridge. He asked shopkeepers about their recent interactions with undesirable elements. He reminded them that property values depended on maintaining certain standards. Mrs. Whitmore listened to Hawk's concerns about the Apache children being influenced by outside agitators. She nodded when he explained how such influences could spread. She agreed that the situation needed addressing before it affected commerce. Other business owners received similar visits. The message was clear. Supporting the wrong people could be costly. Word spread through town about the strange new family living in the canyon. Some folks called it unnatural. Others whispered about what might happen if such arrangements became common. Fear mixed with prejudice in dangerous proportions. Simi started bringing her drawings to show Addie. At first, they seemed like ordinary sketches of canyon life. Birds in flight, sunset over red rocks, desert flowers blooming after rare rain. Then Addie noticed details that didn't belong in nature scenes. Men with surveying equipment appearing in multiple pictures. The same faces drawn from different angles and distances. Notes written in broken English describing when and where these encounters happened. Chiara explained they had been watching strangers visit their land for months. The men came at night mostly. They measured distances and drove stakes into the ground. They paid special attention to the burial area. The twins had documented everything. Their artistic skills and careful observation had created an inadvertent record of trespassing and illegal surveying. Addie's mind began connecting pieces. Her years of watching her husband navigate legal documents had taught her to recognize patterns. These midnight visits weren't random. Someone was planning something that required detailed knowledge of the canyon's layout. Hawk's frustration grew as weeks passed. The situation he had expected to resolve itself was becoming entrenched. Worse, people were starting to ask questions about his business practices. He needed a more direct approach. He called for a town meeting. The subject would be maintaining community standards and property values. He made sure to emphasize how outside influences could threaten everything respectable citizens had built. The announcement posted outside the general store drew immediate attention. Mrs. Whitmore told her customers that it was about time someone addressed the situation. Other business owners expressed similar sentiments. Sheriff Graves read the announcement with growing unease. He knew Hawk well enough to recognize manipulation disguised as civic concern. He also knew his own position was precarious. Supporting the wrong side could cost him his job and his reputation. Anonymous notes started appearing around town. Someone was asking questions about land deals and banking practices. Someone was stirring up trouble that could affect everyone's prosperity. The notes warned that certain individuals should leave voluntarily before the situation became more complicated. Addie found one of these warnings tucked under a rock near their canyon entrance. The message was clear enough. The spelling was poor enough to seem like it came from an uneducated troublemaker rather than someone with means and influence. She showed the note to Chiara and Simi. They studied it with the serious expressions of children who had learned too young that the world contained real dangers. Addie felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These girls had offered her shelter when she had nowhere to go. Now her presence might be putting them in danger, but running away wouldn't solve the real problem. Someone wanted this land badly enough to forge documents and make threats. Someone with power and resources was targeting two orphaned children. The town meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. Addie suspected it would determine all their futures. The town hall filled beyond capacity. Men stood along the walls when chairs ran out. Women fanned themselves with whatever papers they could find. Children peered through windows from outside. Hawk commanded the front of the room like a preacher at revival. He spoke about property values and moral standards. He painted pictures of chaos that would follow if certain elements were allowed to take root in their community. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. People murmured agreement when he described threats to their way of life. Fear spread through the room like smoke from a badly tended fire. Addie sat near the back with Chiara and Simi flanking her. The twins kept their eyes forward and their backs straight. Their dignity in the face of hostile stares reminded Addie of her late husband facing down courthouse bullies in Atlanta. Sheriff Graves stood against the side wall. His hand rested on his gun belt out of habit rather than intention. His eyes moved constantly between Hawk's performance and the crowd's reactions. Hawk's voice rose as he reached his crescendo. He spoke about outside agitators corrupting innocent children. He described how such influences could spread like disease through a healthy community. He suggested that immediate action was necessary to prevent permanent damage. Someone from the middle of the crowd shouted agreement. Others joined in. The suggestion became demand. The demand became roar. Mrs. Whitmore stood up from her front row seat. She declared that decent people had rights too. She insisted that property owners shouldn't have to tolerate situations that made them uncomfortable in their own town. More voices joined the chorus. The mood shifted from concern to anger. Anger moved toward action. Hawk stepped back and let the crowd's momentum build. He had lit the fuse. Now he could watch the explosion from a safe distance. Sheriff Graves felt the shift in the room's energy. He had seen mobs form before. He knew how quickly reasonable people could become unreasonable. He also knew his duty was to maintain order, not necessarily justice. Someone suggested they march to the canyon immediately. Someone else proposed giving the troublemakers 1 hour to pack and leave. A third voice recommended making sure they understood the consequences of returning. Addie felt Chiara's hand slip into hers. Simi moved closer until their shoulders touched. The three of them sat like an island in a sea of hostility. Then Addie stood up. The room didn't quiet immediately. Conversations continued in pockets. Hawk looked annoyed at the interruption of his carefully orchestrated moment. Addie's voice cut through the noise. She asked to speak before they passed judgment. Laughter rippled through sections of the crowd. Someone called out that she had caused enough trouble already. Another voice suggested she should have left when she had the chance, but something in her bearing made people pause. She stood with the posture of someone accustomed to addressing groups. Her voice carried the authority of education and experience. She began by acknowledging their concerns about property values and community standards. She agreed that outside influences could indeed threaten what people had worked to build. The crowd settled slightly. This wasn't the defensive pleading they had expected. Addie continued. She described her education at Oberlin College, where she had studied literature and law alongside students of all backgrounds. She explained her years teaching constitutional principles to newly freed citizens in Atlanta. Her late husband had been a court clerk who spent evenings sharing legal procedures with her. Together, they had helped dozens of families navigate property disputes and civil rights violations. The room grew quieter as people processed this information. The woman they had dismissed as a vagrant possessed credentials that exceeded most of their own. Addie reached into her bag and pulled out documents she had been studying for weeks. She spread them on a nearby table and invited Sheriff Graves to examine them. The papers contained property deeds, survey maps, and legal correspondence related to land throughout the territory. Addie's analysis revealed patterns of fraud that extended far beyond the canyon where she lived with the twins. Signatures had been forged on multiple documents. Property transfers had been backdated to periods when the supposed sellers were already deceased. Legal descriptions had been altered to include acreage that belonged to other parties. Sheriff Graves studied the evidence with growing alarm. His law enforcement experience confirmed what Addie's legal training had uncovered. Someone had been systematically stealing land through fraudulent documentation. Chiara and Simi stepped forward with their own contribution to the evidence. They carried a leather portfolio filled with drawings and written observations. Simi's artwork documented months of nighttime surveying activities on their property. Her detailed sketches showed men with equipment, measuring distances and driving stakes near the sacred burial grounds. Chiara's careful notes recorded dates, times, and descriptions of these unauthorized visits. Her broken English couldn't hide the precision of her observations or the intelligence behind her documentation. The twins explained how they had hidden and watched strangers trespass on their ancestral land. They described hearing conversations about silver deposits and development opportunities. Addie connected their testimony to the fraudulent documents. The surveying activities matched locations described in forged property transfers. The timeline corresponded with recent changes in banking records. The evidence pointed to a coordinated scheme to seize native land through illegal means. The profits would come from mining operations that would destroy sacred burial sites. Hawk's face had grown increasingly pale as the presentation continued. He attempted to interrupt several times, claiming that wild accusations shouldn't be entertained from unreliable sources. But Sheriff Graves was examining signature samples with a magnifying glass. His expression grew grimmer with each comparison. The forgeries were sophisticated but not perfect. The crowd's energy had shifted again. Confusion replaced anger. People began asking questions about their own property transactions. Concerns arose about the stability of their local banking system. Addie had transformed the mob's target from herself, and the twins to the man who had manipulated them into forming a mob in the first place. Hawk pushed to the front of the room with desperate energy. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the evening cool. His carefully maintained composure cracked like old paint. He declared that wild accusations from questionable sources shouldn't distract from the real issues. He reminded everyone that property values and community standards were at stake. He suggested that certain people would say anything to avoid accountability for their disruptive behavior. His voice rose as he appealed directly to the crowd's prejudices. He asked if they really intended to let outsiders dictate terms to honest citizens who had built this town with their own hands. Some heads nodded. A few voices murmured agreement, but the energy had shifted. Doubt had crept into minds that moments before had been certain. Sheriff Graves continued examining the documents spread across the table. His law enforcement training had taught him to recognize forgery techniques. These papers showed multiple signs of alteration and fabrication. He looked up from his magnifying glass with a grim expression. The evidence was compelling enough to warrant investigation, more than compelling enough to question the banker's integrity. Hawk saw the sheriff's reaction and knew his position was deteriorating. He made one final desperate appeal to the crowd's basest instincts. He declared that they shouldn't allow themselves to be manipulated by people who didn't belong in their community. He asked if they wanted their children growing up in a place where traditional values meant nothing. He pointed directly at Addie and the twins. He spoke about bloodlines and heritage and the natural order that God had established. The room fell silent. Even his supporters seemed uncomfortable with the naked hatred in his words. Sheriff Graves felt something shift inside his chest. Memories surfaced of another time and place where he had remained silent while injustice wore the mask of law and order. He had been a young soldier during the war. He had watched officers abuse their authority while he followed orders and stayed quiet. He had told himself that speaking up would accomplish nothing except destroying his own career. But those compromises had hollowed out something inside him. Years of small betrayals of conscience had left him empty in ways he was only beginning to understand. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd. His voice carried the authority of his badge and the weight of his experience. He confirmed that the documents showed clear evidence of fraudulent activity. Banking records would need to be examined. Property transfers would require verification. The territorial authorities would need to be notified. Hawk protested that he was being railroaded by people with questionable motives. He demanded to know why a sheriff would take the word of troublemakers over that of respectable citizens. Graves replied that evidence spoke louder than reputation. His job was to uphold the law regardless of who broke it. The crowd stirred uneasily. People exchanged glances and whispered questions. The certainty that had brought them here was dissolving into confusion and concern. Mrs. Whitmore stood up from her front row seat. Her face was pale and her hands shook slightly. She looked older than she had an hour earlier. She spoke in a voice barely loud enough to carry through the room. She admitted that Hawk had visited her store several weeks earlier. He had suggested that supporting certain elements in the community could affect her business relationships. She revealed that her son had died fighting for the Union during the war. She had been carrying anger and grief that had no proper target. Hawk had given her someone to blame for losses that had nothing to do with the people she had mistreated. Her confession broke something open in the room. Other business owners began shifting uncomfortably. Guilty looks passed between people who had accepted Hawk's influence without questioning his motives. The storekeeper who ran the hardware supply admitted that Hawk had pressured him to refuse service to certain customers. The woman who owned the boarding house revealed similar conversations about maintaining standards and protecting property values. A pattern emerged of systematic intimidation, disguised as civic concern. Hawk had manipulated legitimate worries about economic stability into weapons against anyone who threatened his schemes. Addie watched the revelations unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These people weren't evil. They were frightened and manipulated. They had allowed fear to override their better instincts. Chiara and Simi stood close beside her. Their young faces showed wisdom beyond their years. They had survived by understanding how desperation could make people dangerous. Hawk made one last desperate gambit. He pulled out a surveyor's report that claimed to show valuable mineral deposits throughout the canyon area. He argued that developing these resources would benefit the entire community. He insisted that sentimental attachment to burial grounds shouldn't prevent progress that could make everyone prosperous. The argument might have worked an hour earlier, but the crowd had seen too much evidence of his dishonesty to trust his promises of shared wealth. Sheriff Graves examined the surveyor's report and found it dated after the fraudulent property transfers had been executed. The document appeared to be part of the scheme rather than justification for it. He announced that Silas Hawk was under arrest for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The investigation would determine the full extent of his criminal activities. Hawk's face went through several colors as the reality of his situation sank in. He looked around the room for support that was no longer there. The crowd that had gathered to drive out troublemakers found themselves witnesses to the arrest of the town's most prominent citizen. Mrs. Whitmore approached Addie with tears in her eyes. She asked for forgiveness that she knew she didn't deserve. She offered to do whatever she could to make amends for her shameful behavior. Other townspeople followed her example. They apologized for their participation in what they now recognized as organized persecution. The evening that had begun with mob violence ended with community soul-searching. Sheriff Graves led Hawk away in iron shackles as the crowd dispersed into the night. The bankers' protests echoed off the empty buildings until the jailhouse door slammed shut. His empire of lies had crumbled in a single evening. The investigation that followed revealed corruption extending far beyond Copper Ridge. Territorial authorities discovered fraudulent land deals in 3 counties. Banking records showed systematic embezzlement dating back years. Hawk had built his wealth on stolen property and forged documents. Addie spent long days at the courthouse, helping officials untangle the legal complexities. Her expertise in constitutional law proved invaluable in determining which transactions were legitimate and which were crimes. The territorial governor personally thanked her for exposing what he called the most extensive fraud in the region's history. Mrs. Whitmore became Addie's most dedicated ally in town. She closed her store early each day to bring food and supplies to the canyon. Her guilt drove her to acts of generosity that gradually transformed into genuine friendship. The hardware store owner donated materials to improve the twins' shelter. The boarding house proprietor offered Addie a permanent room at no charge. Other business owners competed to make amends for their previous hostility. But the most surprising discovery came when Addie was helping Chiara organize their grandmother's belongings. Hidden in a leather pouch were documents that predated the recent troubles by decades. The papers included marriage certificates, birth records, and family correspondence written in careful English. Among them was a letter addressed to someone with Addie's married surname. The date showed it had been written 20 years earlier. Chiara translated the Apache portions, while Addie puzzled over the English sections. The letter had been written by the twins' grandfather to a relative who had married into another tribe and moved east. The relative's name was Samuel Monroe. Addie's late husband had mentioned an uncle named Samuel who had disappeared during the Indian Wars. Family stories suggested he had been killed in battle, but his body was never found. Further investigation revealed that Samuel had not died in combat. He had been wounded and nursed back to health by Apache healers. He had fallen in love with a chief's daughter and chosen to stay with her people rather than return to his old life. The twins' grandmother had been Samuel's daughter. Chiara and Simi were Addie's late husband's cousins. The connection she had felt with them from their first meeting had been more than coincidence. This revelation explained the twins' intuitive trust in Addie. Their grandmother had told them stories about relatives who lived among white people but carried Apache blood. They had recognized something familiar in Addie's bearing and character. The territorial authorities used the Copper Ridge case to strengthen legal protections for native lands throughout the region. Addie's expertise helped draft new regulations that made fraudulent seizures more difficult and penalties more severe. Sheriff Graves requested that the territorial government appoint Addie as the region's first civil rights advocate. Her unique combination of legal training and cultural understanding made her ideal for protecting vulnerable communities from exploitation. The position came with a salary that would support her small family comfortably. It also came with an office in the courthouse and official authority to investigate discrimination and fraud. Town council members who had initially opposed Addie's presence now competed to support her appointment. They recognized that having a respected territorial official based in Copper Ridge would enhance their community's reputation and attract legitimate business investment. The twins' ancestral burial grounds received official protection as a territorial cultural site. No mining or development would ever be permitted on the sacred land. Future generations would inherit the same connection to their ancestors that had sustained Chiara and Simi through their darkest months. Hawk's former bank building became available when territorial authorities seized his assets to compensate victims of his fraud. The building was large enough to serve multiple community needs with proper renovation. Mrs. Whitmore proposed converting the space into a school that would serve all the region's children regardless of background. Her late son's military service pay, saved for years with no purpose, would fund the initial construction and supplies. Other community members contributed labor and materials. The same people who had formed a mob weeks earlier now worked together to build something positive from the wreckage of Hawk's schemes. Addie agreed to serve as the school's first teacher while maintaining her territorial advocacy duties. Her curriculum would include basic subjects for younger students and constitutional law for older ones who showed interest and aptitude. The legal proceedings against Hawk revealed the full scope of his criminal network. Several accomplices in other towns were arrested. Properties worth thousands of dollars were returned to their rightful owners. The territorial banking system implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar fraud. During one of the court sessions, Hawke made a final desperate attempt to discredit Addie's testimony. He claimed that no judge should trust the word of someone whose loyalties were divided between races and cultures. The territorial judge responded by noting that Addie's mixed heritage gave her unique insight into the communities she served. Her ability to bridge different worlds made her more valuable, not less trustworthy. Hawke received a sentence of 20 years in territorial prison. His co-conspirators received lesser terms based on their level of involvement. The message was clear that fraud and discrimination would face serious consequences. As spring arrived in Copper Ridge, the transformation was remarkable. The town that had nearly torn itself apart over fear and prejudice was rebuilding itself on foundations of justice and inclusion. Addie stood in the doorway of the renovated school building watching Chiara and Simi help younger children with their lessons. Sunlight streamed through new windows onto desks where Apache, Mexican, and white children learned together. The pocket watch in her dress still ticked steadily against her ribs, but now it felt like a heartbeat of hope rather than a reminder of loss. 6 months had transformed Copper Ridge beyond recognition. The school bell rang each morning to summon children from across the territory. Apache, Mexican, and white families sent their sons and daughters to learn together in the renovated bank building. Addie stood at the front of her classroom watching 23 eager faces. Reading lessons filled the morning hours. Basic arithmetic occupied the afternoons. Constitutional principles rounded out the curriculum for older students who showed interest in law and government. Chiara had become her most capable assistant. The girl's natural teaching ability emerged as she helped younger children with their letters and numbers. Her patience with struggling students reminded Addie of her own early teaching days in Atlanta. Simi's artistic talents had found new purpose, documenting the school's daily activities. Her drawings captured moments of discovery and friendship that bridged cultural divides. The Territorial Education Department had commissioned her to create illustrations for new textbooks. The twins' transformation from frightened orphans to confident young women represented the broader changes throughout the community. Their security and happiness reflected in improved relationships between all the town's diverse families. Mrs. Whitmore had established a scholarship fund using her late son's military pay and profits from her expanding business. The fund supported promising students who wanted to pursue advanced education in territorial colleges and universities. Her partnership with Addie had grown into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Their collaboration demonstrated how former enemies could become powerful allies when guilt transformed into action. Sheriff Graves stopped by the school most afternoons to report on his territorial civil rights enforcement activities. The legal precedents established in the Hawke case had been applied successfully in dozen other communities facing similar challenges. His transformation from reluctant enforcer to passionate advocate had inspired other law enforcement officials throughout the region. The territorial governor had promoted him to deputy territorial marshal in recognition of his exemplary service. The former mob members now served on the school board with enthusiasm that matched their previous hostility. They had learned that building communities required different skills than destroying them. Their energy channeled into positive directions had produced remarkable results. The hardware store owner had become the school's unofficial maintenance supervisor. His donation of materials had evolved into hands-on involvement in every improvement project. His carpentry skills had created playground equipment and garden spaces. The boarding house proprietor organized community events that brought families together for education and entertainment. Her monthly cultural celebrations featured food, music, and stories from different traditions represented in their diverse population. Even former skeptics acknowledged that diversity had strengthened rather than weakened their community. Property values had indeed increased, as the town's reputation for fairness attracted new residents and businesses. Addie's territorial advocacy work had expanded beyond individual cases to policy development and training programs. Her expertise was sought by communities throughout the Southwest, facing similar challenges with land rights and cultural conflicts. The twins' ancestral burial grounds had become a place of pilgrimage for Apache families from across the territory. The site's protection had established important legal precedents for preserving native sacred spaces against commercial exploitation. Young couples requested permission to marry in the canyon, where love had triumphed over hatred. The ceremony site overlooked the school, where their future children would learn alongside classmates from every background. Territorial authorities had implemented the Copper Ridge model in other communities struggling with similar issues. The combination of legal advocacy, educational integration, and community healing had proven effective in multiple contexts. The approach emphasized dignity over confrontation and inclusion over separation. Results demonstrated that justice achieved through moral authority lasted longer than justice imposed through force or manipulation. Hawk's network of corruption had been completely dismantled throughout the region. His 20-year prison sentence served as a deterrent to others who might consider similar schemes. Victims of his fraud had recovered most of their stolen property. The banking reforms implemented after his conviction had restored public confidence in financial institutions. New oversight procedures protected depositors and borrowers from exploitation by unscrupulous officials. Addie's legal advocacy had helped establish the Territorial Civil Rights Commission with authority to investigate discrimination and enforce equal treatment under law. The Commission's work had prevented dozens of potential conflicts through early intervention and mediation. Her success had inspired other educated women to pursue careers in law and government service. The Territorial University had established scholarships specifically for women seeking legal education and public service training. On this particular afternoon, Addie stood at the schoolhouse window watching children play together in the yard. Their laughter echoed off the canyon walls where sacred burial grounds rested in protected peace. The pocket watch still ticked against her ribs with each heartbeat, but now it measured moments of joy rather than marking time until the next hardship. Her husband's memory lived on through the justice she pursued and the family she had built. Chiara and Simi called her mother now in both English and Apache. The legal adoption had formalized bonds that had been forged through mutual need and deepened through shared purpose. Their family had grown from desperation into love. The view through her window encompassed the entire transformation. Sacred grounds preserved for future generations. Diverse children learning together. Former enemies working as partners. Justice achieved through dignity rather than force. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden as another successful day drew to a close in the community they had built together. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.